Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, Maajid Nawaz, and Rabbi David Rose.
Dear friends, we're running a bit late, so this conversation is going to be a little briefer than was perhaps anticipated, and probably you don't need much more conversation after the very inspiring and moving words that you've heard from both our speakers. But perhaps if I could just pick up from Simone's last comment and turn to you, Maajid. Do you think that it is possible for us to be able to address this challenge if one ignores the Muslim religious hardcore?
No, I don't think, first of all, I really don't mean to stand between anyone and their dinner, so I appreciate that we
Don't worry, they'll tell us when we've got to go.
when they're hungry. I don't think that Simone meant in her remarks, I'm sure you can speak for yourself, that we ignore them, but actually rather what's been happening for so many decades is that they are the only ones we have been speaking to. I know that in the United Kingdom's case, definitely what's been happening is that for decades, through the 90s especially, and that's when the French actually coined the phrase Londonistan, with which to refer to London, it was official government policy to seek out so-called community leaders who tended to be Muslim, male, incredibly conservative in their interpretation of their own faith, and also unrepresentative, and that they were the ones who were deemed to be the interlocutors on behalf of the community. There has been a slight change of late, along the lines of what, Simone, you've suggested, and that is that at least there's been a recognition, and I'm hearing increasingly voices such as yours in the UK as well, there's been a recognition that these community leaders aren't necessarily leaders. In many instances, they are unelected mosque imams who speak on behalf of the usually all-male, very, very religiously conservative mosque committee, and they speak on behalf of, their sort of tribal or religious or community customs, and they don't necessarily represent the true diversity within Muslim communities. And so people are increasingly seeking reform Muslim voices, feminist Muslims, liberal Muslims. There are ex-Muslims who have a stake in this debate as well. That's at least that realization is dawning, though there's a long way to go still in that quest.
So do you think then, Simone, that the problem is essentially, you mentioned, of course, the question of shared values, and I'm sure that you might even include me as an Orthodox rabbi in your camp on that with certain reservations. But never, do you think that maybe then the real challenge is one of acculturation, to which degree, therefore, communities are integrated, or do you think it's something that goes far beyond the question of integration?
I think it goes beyond the question of integration. I think it is very much about the idea of universal values. I want to just pick up on what Maajid said about the tendency to want to speak to the representative voices. On French TV, when we seek an expert on Islam, most of the time we come up with someone like Tariq Ramadan, for example. It's very problematic. It's very problematic because, not only because of what he represents on television, but it's also very problematic for most in the Muslim community. Most of those who I speak to say that he doesn't represent anything.
So that's fascinating. So you're saying the vast majority of Muslims in France do not identify with that. That would seem to tie up with the Times of Israel survey today that indicated that 92% of French have a positive image of Jews. How do you manage to square that with the reality?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure how representative the survey is. There are others that are not that positive.
But 92% is an amazing figure.
It is. I'm not 100%.
So let's take to 72. It's still 72. Will still include lots of Muslims.
Yeah.
I think also it's important to mention that they have a constituency, so that constituency does also need to be spoken to. What I mean is the religious imams have a constituency, they certainly do. So let's not boycott them from the conversation. I don't think that's what's being suggested. But let's add to that the fact that there are a bunch of other voices out there. No one can truly represent, which is why I never claim myself to represent anyone. I speak on my own behalf and stand for the ideas and the values that I believe in, and let me be judged by those human rights values that I espouse. No one should be on a stage or on a platform saying, I am the Muslim voice, and I say this is what Muslims think. It's absurd. It's as absurd as Christopher Columbus turning up to this great continent and saying to the Native Americans, hey, hail, bring me your leader. You know, it's that old form of colonial policy, thinking that Muslims are somehow a fifth column that require an internal leadership figure to speak on their behalf, when in fact they should be seen as citizens like everyone else, who when it comes to politics speak through their elected representatives. When it comes to religious or communal issues, we need to respect the true diversity, especially in the case that there is no true clergy. For Sunni Islam, which is 80% of the world's Muslims, there is no hierarchy, there is no pope, so there is a diversity of voices within that. And hey, we only need to look at Iraq and Syria and see how even Al-Qaeda is fighting ISIS to recognize that they can't even agree with each other on what Islamism should look like. So
yeah, we
got to look at
sometimes
that
think they might
diversity.
be Jewish, you know, two Jews, three opinions. I mean, it's something. Certainly,
You know, in France
fortunately, we
we
haven't done it violently. At
You
least.
know, in France we have a tendency to want to organize everything like the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah,
the
that's right.
the French Jewish community is organized that way. We want to do exactly the same thing about the Muslim community, but it doesn't work that way. And there is immense frustration, honestly, amongst, I don't know if they're everybody and all French Muslim, but all the people I talk to, there is immense frustration because they feel that the voices that they hear today on French television, on French radio, are not representative of
That's
anything.
very hopeful.
It is very hopeful.
And now, somebody like Imam Shalgoumi, who comes to Israel and has traveled across France to go with Rabbi Serfati and preaches there for mutual respect, is he seen as a nutcase, as totally marginal? Or does he respond to these vast majority of Muslims whom you're talking about in France who want that kind of engagement?
No, I think the reality is, and I'm being very honest here, I'm not sure I should be. Imam Shalgoumi is a great friend. He definitely shares with us the values, but I'm not sure he's representative either, because at the end of the day, he again represents an older male Muslim coming from Tunisia. There is an entire generation of young people in their 20s to their 40s that have no voice. And they don't necessarily want to be represented by an imam. They want to be represented by maybe or not, but they want to hear voices of Muslim reformists.
Okay, but the message that he's conveying is one they want.
The message is okay. It's more about the personality and the fact that they want to see younger, more secular and
Plenty of us
reformist
want to get
voices.
rid of us. We're old fogies.
Can I be honest as well?
I assume you have been.
Yes. So I'll continue to be. Because hearing what Simone said, I don't even know how many people are happy that I speak, because I face a lot of backlash too, especially when I do
something
things,
else in common.
Well, especially when I do things like retweet the cartoon of an image of a Prophet Muhammad on Twitter and say I'm not offended by it. You know, I've got a lot of backlash for that. So I think the key is no one has the right to speak on behalf of an entire community. I think the key is to focus on the values, as Simone was saying. What is it? What is the goal? Where do we want to get to? We want to get to a pluralistic, tolerant society, respectful of its minorities, because that's a litmus test for any true democracy, is it will be respectful of its minority communities. In this case, the Jewish community within Muslim communities, respectful of the minorities within that minority community.
Absolutely.
The gay Muslims, the feminist Muslims, the liberal Muslims. So that's the goal. We want to get to that goal of respect, pluralism, and tolerance and human rights. Let's focus on those values and find voices that espouse those values.
Absolutely. Let me change just a little bit in terms of the 5 minutes that we've got left. You have a unique experience. The vast majority of the world does not know the inside mind of the radicalized youth who seem to be, therefore, very often increasing in numbers. Give us some kind of insight of what it is that radicalizes young people who very often have grown up a generation or two in Western countries to make them want to be so violent and so hateful.
Well, Rabbi, I'll be selling my book outside and signing it for copies. It's an autobiography called Radical.
Well, give us a sentence.
That's the short answer. Yes. Seriously, though, there is a combination of, especially in the Western context, there's a combination of identity politics that's kicked in, with a perceived sense of grievance against one's own group, how one identifies themselves, in this case, Muslim tribal politics, tribal identity, a perceived sense of grievance, which leads to an identity crisis. And then into that void step charismatic recruiters who peddle an ideological narrative. And that last point, the ideological narrative, is the one that has been most neglected up until today, because there's a strong and firm body of studies, research out there that looks at the so-called grievances, looks at, especially from the left wing in Europe, looks at kind of, the place of minorities in society. What hasn't been really addressed in the way that it should be is what that ideology is, what I call the ideology of Islamism. How the Islamist narrative spins world events and reinforces that sense of grievance and victimhood, and how that then plays out against other communities, including Jewish communities across Europe. So we've got to start looking at those four factors. We've got to start looking at the grievances, the identity crisis, and the charismatic recruiters, the role they play, and the ideology holistically. And that requires a holistic strategy to deal with that within communities. And it's unfortunate that the last 5 years of the coalition government in the United Kingdom, despite being repeatedly promised that they would publish a counter-extremism strategy, we are still waiting for one that works with communities to address extremism before it gets violent.
And in France, is there any such initiative to address that extremism?
Yes, but also I would like to say I think in France we really have waited for far too long. We've spent some time on condemning, putting people into prisons. We have spent some time on intelligence research, but we have done very, very little in terms of prevention. AJC has been for 10 years been saying to the French government and other governments, has been alerting about the problem of, for example, radicalization within prisons. It's only now that we are starting to think about possible ways of isolating those who are radicalizing others in prison, for example. But then in France as well, we don't have yet a counter and radicalization strategy, meaning that what happens not only once someone is radicalized, but how can you make sure that we prevent young people from getting radicalized? And to this date, I don't think we have a comprehensive strategy on prevention of radicalization.
Well, we can't even name it. People are scared to use the word Islamism. How many people here have read the Harry Potter books? I have, all of them. I'm a bit of a geek like that, right? Oh, you have, Simone. Good, right. Well, in those, you'll know that the baddie in the book, the evil guy, is called Voldemort, right? And J.K. Rowling's genius in these books is that the characters in the book are so scared to name Voldemort that they refer consistently and continuously throughout the entire story to this bad evil person as he who must not be named. Now, of course, what that does is, by the way, they're also in denial that he who must not be named is actually still alive and among us. So there's two levels of denial there. First, he's not even alive when he is alive and active, and second, we can't even name him. Now, President Obama reminds me of this because, in many of his speeches, until very, very recently, and it's probably after ISIS started enslaving all the Yazidis, but until very recently, whenever this was referred to in public broadcasts, in presentations by politicians, policymakers, leaders of countries, they would say the ideology of extremism. Well, that sounds very much to me like he who must not be named, frankly. Now, what that does is it causes two problems which I worry about very much. One is internal to Muslim communities, and the second is external to them. What's the first one? Internally within Muslim communities, if we cannot name this problem, we deprive those minority reform Muslim voices who are struggling day in, day out. People like Malala Yousafzai, who's been shot in the head because she wanted an education. We deny them with a lexicon with which to address this problem within their own communities.
Does she use the lexicon?
Well, I've never met her. I hope to one day. But we've really got to be able to carve out a lexicon that allows for everyday ordinary Muslims to say, as I said on this stage, that our issue is not with the religion of Islam, but with those who wish to impose it on others, the Islamist ideology.
So we've only got very little more time left. So just tell me, from your religion of Islam, what gives you the greatest inspiration for what you do?
What gives me the greatest inspiration is, I don't claim to be a devout Muslim. I'm not actually a devout Muslim. You can all see my stag night on the internet, actually. It's been recorded and put out there. But what actually gives me the most inspiration is there's a timeless message which I think we have to follow, and that is that there's a strong strand of a desire for justice. And that desire for justice is what inspired me in a misguided way originally at 16 through anger to join Hizb ut-Tahrir, but is also what stayed with me when I realized that we had become the instrument of the very injustice we claimed to be fighting. And that strand of a search for justice stayed with me even now so. That's why I'm seeking justice by challenging the Islamist ideology as I used to espouse it in the past.
And for you, Simone, you already referred to Jewish experience as animating you. But is there one particular aspect of Jewish heritage that gives you particular inspiration in your work?
I think the one that I mentioned is exactly that. It's never again. And I think at the end of the day, I didn't realize it at the time, actually very late, but to what extent it actually determined everything I did in my life. Be it the defense for human rights, the prevention for genocide, the fight against anti-Semitism, making sure that Israel can exist safely in this world. All of this was influenced by Never Again.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to both of you. May I say that you are both an inspiration to us. I'm very grateful for your contribution today. Please, ladies and gentlemen, remain on your seats, because there is a natural segue now into what is the Moral Courage Award. And we've heard both some stories this evening of concern and even, I would say, to frighten us a little, but also heard messages of great hope and inspiration. And I've mentioned there have been transitions from bad relationships to good one, now a relationship that is a bad one, and how do we address that one? But there are some great inspiring relationships, in particular in Israel, and one of the most notable is a relationship between the Druze community and the Jewish majority in Israel, a community very much animated by its own tradition, coming actually out of Islam, a tradition of loyalty to the country of which it's a part. And we will now witness this Moral Courage Award that reflects this very special relationship of a community that is to be found in all different segments of Israeli society, an example of true interreligious intergroup cooperation, but above all in the defense of country, paying a very heavy price, but as a result, truly an inspiration of what loyalty and mutual respect can mean, as we have already heard this evening. So please remain for this very momentous award. Thank you.